Hello, and welcome back to the Games Institute podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Marisa Benjamin.
And I'm Tobin Rossico.
And today we are joined by the one, the only, Cayley MacArthur.
Hello.
Hi, Cayley. We're so excited to have you on the podcast. And not just because you're amazing, but because it seems that so many of our other guests also talk about how amazing you are. So at this point, the listeners are just so excited to get to know you.
That's no pressure.
No pressure. But we will say right off the top that we're past now the year mark of being in COVID lockdown, and the three of us are pretty tired. So if this thing doesn't show off how sparkly Cayley is, well, actually, I'll say it this way. Guaranteed, Cayley is 4 times more sparkly than however sparkly she's going to be, but I know you're going to be amazing and sparkly regardless.
Yeah, Risha and I did everything in our power to show how dull we are in comparison to her.
Oh, absolutely. We are going to open off with an icebreaker question, and then we're just going to have a wonderful conversation afterwards. Tobin, why don't you take that?
All right. So, Cayley, what is your first childhood memory of gaming? It can be board games, video games, make-believe of any kind. Where does this all start?
There's a photograph that I have from when I was 4 or younger, probably in the 2 to 3 range, which, well, I have it. My mom says all the photos I have are actually hers, but that's a whatever.
That's a different podcast.
And it's my dad and myself at our old computer, and I was playing, I think, one of the Magic School Bus, like CD-ROM games.
Excellent. Yep.
I had so many of those, and I loved them, and I played them for years growing up, and I still remember them. I wish they worked.
You could probably find them in a web browser. There's a lot of that stuff, old DOS games in web browser.
Yeah. Which CD-ROM games were you playing?
There was like the Space Magic School Bus one is the one that I remember the most. Yeah.
No way. Yeah, and
that game was great.
I think this came up maybe like way back in the day, possibly as one of my earliest childhood memories. Miss Frizzle saying, "Pick a personality," and I didn't know. Do you remember that?
No.
No, it's maybe level 0 of the game, as in before you get to the game itself. But I got just so stumped because I didn't know what personality meant. Yeah.
I don't have very many memories of like actually playing it. I remember the scenery the most, and like the vibe that I got from a lot of different games. So there was another underwater one where you could go into these caves, and they were quite dark, and I had no idea like what you did, but I just liked exploring and I guess following the story and doing the best that my little self could to do what the game was asking me to do.
Aw, that's the sweetest. And how did you graduate from those into the next game? Do you remember what would have followed that?
Ooh, Age of Empires. I spend a lot of time on that. And The Sims, and a lot of my playing of games was with my friends because my mom didn't allow a console in the house growing up. I paved the way for my brother who came after me to have a much easier time getting into playing games because I had nothing, so I'm not very literate when it comes to like console-based games and like using controllers and stuff, which now feels like almost like an impediment. It's like when you go to a party and you haven't read the news in 10 years, so then you like can't talk to anyone about it. Like it feels like that.
Especially Games Institute parties.
Yeah, exactly. So I do my best to catch up now with people who are extremely patient of the terrible mistakes and questions that I ask. But yeah, there's a lot of like world building types of games that I liked as I got older, and games where I could collaborate with my friends too. Anyone who had a computer in their basement, we would just be like down there.
Amazing. Roller Coaster Tycoon.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah. I'm just checking. I'm pretty sure we had almost the same childhood, except I was the second born child, so my sister carved the path for me. But this is great because this is, every time we have a guest in my mind, I play this game at the beginning of like, is this going to be a Tobin episode or a Marisa episode, right? Are they going to be super literate with consoles and I'm going to sit here and smile and nod? But no, I think this is a Marisa leaning one.
I was the
Yeah.
poor Mac kid that just like played emulated Super Nintendo games, so I don't know anything about 90s era PC stuff. So it's
Oh
all
my
you.
gosh. That's sweet. Well, you know what? Later on, when we talk about what you're currently playing, which, tends to be how we close out, possibly Tobin will know way more than me because I have to say I have not changed. I'm still very much just in like the online world building games. Yeah.
I did send
So,
you a link in the chat about the Magic School Bus stuff, so see if that's what they were.
I remember the human body one. Oh my gosh. Oh my
And they're
gosh.
playable in browser, so you just click them and then
oh,
you get started.
well, stop the
Okay.
podcast here. We have
Yeah.
to just go
Thanks
play.
for
No.
listening today. We have some
Right,
research to
that's
do.
it.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Cayley, what is your research about? What are you doing? We have to get into like all of that, but right off the top, who are you?
Uh, I'm in the final stretch of my PhD in systems design engineering, but um, I very much don't think that actually answers the question, who are you? Because um, I got here via knowledge integration in my undergrad, where I thought I was going to be a doctor and an art historian, and maybe go into marketing. And then I was like, I don't know what to do. And then I went to Concordia for a year, and then I came back, and then I was like, I love UX. Like, I think it took. I so appreciated being in an interdisciplinary program because it wasn't a bad thing to take a variety of courses. Like, I was the kind of person who came out of high school and deciding what to take in university. A lot of my friends were like, well, I'm just going to take the thing that I have the highest marks in. And like, not bragging, but like, like just my marks are fairly high in all the things. And I really enjoyed all the things. And I didn't want to give up any of them. So I kind of took a risk going into this new program. Like, it was the first cohort. And I was generally a pretty risk averse person growing up. But I think that really paid off because it gave me the time that I needed after high school to explore all these other areas like more deeply. And I was able to finally realize that there was a way I could connect my interests. It just, early on, like UX, I'm not going to say that UX wasn't a thing because it definitely was, but it wasn't something that was accessible as it is now, that you would hear people talking about, or that undergrads are learning about it now and going and getting internships in it. Whereas when I was in the last year of my undergrad, I just stumbled across this book, and I was really interested in like language and how people think and how we can design to kind of influence people's behavior. And I knew I wanted to work with technology, and then it finally fit together under this umbrella and gave me a pathway for moving forward. It just took a while to get there. So then I went into a master's in English, which is maybe not the next step that you were expecting. But Neil Randall from the Games Institute had supervised my undergrad project where I looked at rhetoric and how you can apply rhetoric in user experience design decisions to kind of guide behavior. And he kind of roped me in. And I think like Waterloo just has such a great English program with all the different approaches you can take to it. And no one made me feel like weird for doing this very HCI leaning type of work that I was doing. I didn't necessarily feel it was the right move for me to go into a computer science program, nor was I qualified to do so. I really wanted the space to dig into more like critical theory to kind of flesh out some of these ideas and thoughts I was having, and Waterloo gave me the space to do that. And then I wanted to be more hands-on, so then I ended up doing a joint master's in English and systems design.
Wow.
And now I just want to be able to tell people I'm in one program with one name that you can Google and know what it is. So that's how I got here.
Did you do undergrad, master's, and now PhD all at U Waterloo?
I did.
Another triple crown for the podcast.
Yeah, although new category as well. I don't know if I know anybody else who did 3 degrees, like the undergrad, master's, PhD, all different. It's very cool.
The rainbow triple crown.
Yeah, so there we go.
Yeah, if anyone
the Neapolitan, that's more probably, yeah.
Like navigating the admin and bureaucracy at this school, like I want another degree in that.
We all do.
You could probably advise now on how to with the student experience. Even the way that you talk about your experience with each program and how they helped discover this thing inside of you that you had all along, it's wonderful. You're a poster child for what UW could offer. And I particularly really appreciate hearing you talk about the English program being a space for exploration. I find that too. It's very special that the faculty members in the English department and the department itself, they encourage you to think outside the box of what you could do with an English degree. And I have a hard time explaining what my experience was with it, and even research. The Games Institute English students have a lot of time, a lot of they have a hard time explaining, what it means to do games research from an English perspective. And it's exactly what you said. So now I'm going to, borrow that vocabulary for when I do tours of the Games Institute, that these degrees, not just English, systems design as well, computer science, the way that we do it, it's all space for exploration of what you could do with that within the discipline.
So have you pondered the fact that playing those old PC games, do you think that impacts your interest in UX, or was that kind of brought on by like the smartphone era or something like that, where you said, if this stuff is always with us, like where did that seed start to flourish? And then, yeah, that's part one.
And before you answer, just for anyone listening, UX stands for user experience.
And if I say HCI, it means human computer interaction. I had read this book called The Information by James Gleick, I think, and I definitely butchered his last name there, most likely, but it was like, what's the word for a thing that you do when you have free time and it's just for fun?
Pleasure?
A hobby? Oh, pleasure. Yeah, that. It was a book I read for that elusive reason, and learned about different like schools of thought around information theory and communication over time. And so like another one of the reasons I was really drawn to English was just like I've always been so fascinated with language and with communication, how it functions and what role that plays in how we think. And I don't know like where the bridge exactly happened to like bring that into technology, but I started to realize that if language and communication are shaping the way that we like think or communicate or act or behave, um, then it's imposing structures on what we think we can and can't do. And in a similar way, information architecture and interaction design is also imposing those structures on kind of what we think we can do. So design is a form of communication in that way. And I I felt that like UX could be very powerful in that way, and like maybe something that we could understand better using that lens. Like that's kind of where it started, I guess.
That's so
That's really
beautiful.
cool. So then part two of that is, so if you were kind of dabbling with that in your undergrad project and Neil was supervising it, was it him that said, "Hey, Padawan, do you want to come to the Games Institute and see this new world?" Or did you kind of discover the Games Institute by yourself? And then from there, is that how you were guided to HCI?
Um, Neil at the time was still using his office in Haggie Hall.
Okay.
The GI was just a little baby at that time, and I wasn't I wasn't sure that I would even go to grad school because I couldn't think of where the right place for me would be. But yes, he did convince me that I should apply. Yes, I owe him a big one. Um, and it was in a visual rhetoric class with Marcelo Gorman, where he had one of his students come in to give a guest lecture, and that was Adam Bradley, who did his PhD in English and systems design. And he was talking about data visualization and poetry. And so I felt like that lecture, even in that project, was speaking to me. And I was like, don't you think this is kind of reductive trying to like visualize poetry? And then he was like, let's get lunch. And then so he was a huge mentor to me, and he was co-supervised by Mark Hancock, who's the associate director of the Games Institute. And I just in chatting with Adam, I said, I don't think being in the English program is exactly the right fit for me. I would love to do something that's like I want to get my foot in the door in the HCI community because I don't want to be critiquing it from the outside. I want to be able to speak in their language to make an impact in their field. And so he gave me kind of the confidence that I needed. He just said, like, sign up for Mark's class, ask him to supervise you. And I was like, you can do that. And it worked. So that's how I became kind of formally part of the HCI group. And Mark's still my supervisor now.
That's awesome. I love basically with every guest that we interview, there's some hook like that where either it's a student. In a lot of cases it's either like Leonard, Mark, Neil, um, and they're like, hey, just like do what you want to do, there's a space for it. And I think as students we don't realize that there is a space for this kind of wild and wacky stuff that we want to look at, but it really is them being like, come on over and see how it's like over here, and then you're like, oh yeah, this is where I belong.
That's totally.
When I first interacted with your work, it was through the poster that is hanging at the GI. Um, and it's called Gendered or Neutral. That's the title of the poster, and that's your research from your master's program. And I absolutely adore it. So I wonder if you can speak to it, and then we're going to take a hard shift into talking about your PhD research because everything is connected and it's so cool.
Yeah. So that that project was kind of my breakthrough, like language plus HCI
Yeah.
project.
what I
where in a number of different, I don't know, humanities publications, people had kind of problematized the use of the word user because it pulls away agency from people. It dehumanizes them. It's not really reflective of who they are, and it's not helpful to think of them in that way either. Especially when user-centered design, like, what? So you're gonna center the human, but then like just make them a shell of a being. And people had made arguments or tried to make arguments previously in HCI publication venues about like basically using that kind of language, but that type of argumentation is a hard sell in an HCI venue. So I just wanted to try to make the point, but using their own tools. So we did a drawing study where first we looked through a whole year of publications from CHI, which is the biggest publication venue for HCI research, and we pulled out all of the people words, which were user, participant, person, researcher, and designer. But user was by far the most popular. I think there were like 17,000 instances of the word being used. And we used Mechanical Turk, which is a crowdsourcing platform where you can get people to do short tasks. And we had people draw one of those 5 words, and then they filled out a survey about who's in the picture and some kind of like demographic things about those drawings. But also there were open questions about what are they doing, what are the objects in the space, and they also filled out a survey about themselves. So we were able to get a sense too of distance between this concept of who do you think a user is and who are you? Like, do you identify with that?
Wow.
So that was fun. And it made some people angry.
Well, that's
Because
good research.
we're not saying at all that anyone's like, if you use this word you're sexist. Like, no way. We're just saying that when you use ambiguous language, people project the norm into it. And so when we just need to be more aware that that's something that we do. It's subconscious and it's normal to do that. So we need to, as designers and as researchers, just actively work against that urge.
Then your findings from that research showed that when people hear user, they imagine, a white male, cis-het white male. Okay, yeah. And what do we think then about the fact that the field is called user experience research?
And it's funny, I've never thought of that before, but
it's troubling. And I mean, on the one hand, it makes so much sense because user in a way is an active term. So when you're trying to be descriptive about somebody who uses technology, of course you would say user, but now with the descriptiveness of something, I don't know. Perhaps this is just an ambiguous thought for what you are generally building in your study of the infrastructure, information infrastructure, and language and visual rhetoric. And yeah, but I don't know. It's something to think about. I would love to hear if any of our listeners have any thoughts about the fact that it's called user experience. Yeah.
me too.
Then your PhD research, I believe that it builds on your master's work, but did it? And I don't know. Yeah, let's just talk about that.
In a sense, like the through line with all of my work has been kind of this focus on gender, but as things have gone on and as I've just become, I don't know, a smarter person, I think that's a thing that happens like during the PhD, I hope, and just more aware of how complex these issues are. Like you can't just look at gender, you can't just look at race, you can't just look at ability. It's all tied together, and so that has made things much more interesting and also messier. And I don't really know what I'm getting at by saying that, except for that like it's expanded. Um, and my first project in the PhD, like officially, was about makers. So I guess that's like another word that we use, and I think there are certain connotations with maker as there are with hacker and as there are with gamer and user. Because something that I noticed, I was volunteering for the GI Game Jam, and I was curious with the participation kind of breakdown, who was attending and who was staying, who was leaving. And once I started to keep a tally, I noticed over one weekend we lost about 70% of the women who had signed up, who were there on the first day. They weren't there by the end. So then I was like, okay, well, obviously this is a big problem. So I was concerned about it from the angle of like how do we attract people to events like game jams or like hackathons or into maker spaces, but also how do we keep them there? Because yeah, showing up is great if you just have to write a report to say, look how diverse we are, but that's actually there are benefits to participation in these things in the long run. There's some research to show that having a positive experience in an informal learning environment like that then can give you the confidence to sign up for a class to learn more about coding or to take on more complex projects and to get involved in those communities more. So if that's the place where people are dipping their toes in, that could lead to great things for them, and they're not able to do that, then that's a big problem. So I started to think of what are some women-dominated maker groups, and that's how we got to crafting. And that's how I fell in love with quilters. And I did quite a few sessions with different quilting groups to figure out what their social dynamics are, how their communities are structured, what kinds of activities they offer, because I had read about the quilting bee, which is just like a game jam, but for quilting. Because in the game jam, like if people aren't familiar, there's a time limit and there's a theme, and you're working on just either by yourself or collaboratively, you're working on making a game within this time frame of like 2 to 3 days. And the theme is used as a constraint and also a challenge. And you can often add things on top that are called, I think they're called diversifiers, that are like, if you want to add more constraints to kind of make things more interesting, you can do that. And the quilting bee is everyone working on the same thing in a short period of time, trying to get it done. And they're collaborating. And I was like, well, great, I'll just study a quilting bee. But those don't actually happen that often. And the way that these crafting and quilting guilds are structured are that they offer such a wide variety of ways for people to engage with the craft. So if we replace the craft with making games, then there's really a need to offer diverse ways to satisfy people's interest in it, whether that's workshops or a less time pressured space to work on these things, mentorship. In that environment, people are afraid to ask each other questions because they don't want to be perceived as like someone's stealing my idea. Whereas when we move the game jam online, and people are on Discord, then people were helping each other so much because there weren't these people weren't weirded out by the implications the space had on how they interacted with each other. I don't know if I'm rambling now, but I love crafting and I love makers and I love seeing them be able to actually achieve what they want to achieve. Like just setting up the conditions for that is really wonderful.
It's fascinating that you took that route within HCI and UX to go and look at then makers, because in general, you think about makers as somebody who's on the other end of that transaction, people who are shaping the experiences of the technology. But in fact, you were looking at it, from what I gather, from the vantage of how are these people shaped by the technology and the culture surrounding that tech. So how do people actually, from the outset, how do they get taken up into being a part of the community that will then shape it for other folks in the future?
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened to then bring you into the research that you're doing now, which is about the way that VR technology is designed and who is the user that the makers have in mind when they're designing?
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head with like first I looked at encouraging a more diverse group of people into like ways that they might get involved in careers in tech, because if we don't have those people take part and end up staying and developing these technologies, then the technology that comes out the other end is going to be biased towards whoever was around the office to test it out.
Yeah.
So there's a big problem with VR technology in a lot of different ways. Unfortunately, just because of the limited groups of people who are around to really influence its development and some of the design standards that are in place now, or even the data sets that were used. For example, the simulator sickness questionnaire is kind of the standard for measuring people's experience and kind of physical reactions to being in a virtual environment. And it was developed on an entire group of men. And
Who
today,
probably were able-bodied, right? Like,
yeah, they were in the Navy. So,
yeah. So, yeah.
so in addition, the tool is very outdated. Um, and now women experience more cyber sickness and they like more frequently and more severely. And so many papers position it as it's a problem of socialization. Women are just more likely to report, or they have a lower tolerance. And one study called people who dropped out of it quitters, and the ones who stayed were called survivors. And so there's also this idea that like you just have to muscle through it and get used to it. When actually, like, no, and it's not good for research in virtual reality either, because you can see that some people do adapt over time, and so they can overcome those feelings of discomfort and they start to perform better, whereas over time other people start to it just declines. So if you're running a study with 4 conditions and they have short breaks between, then one person is going to have an improved effect throughout and the other person might be throwing up by the end. So how do you really compare that data? Like there's not very good awareness of this in the HCI community in general. And I think it's having a kind of detrimental effect on how usable study results are if people aren't taking into account how people of different genders and different bodies are being affected by their time in a virtual environment.
Wow.
So
My mind is blown.
do you run studies with VR technology and headsets? Like what? I guess that's the first question. Do you do that?
Back in March of 2020, I had ethics applications going in and was working with a student building an environment to test out some things that I hypothesized could, like, in my head, I picture it as levers you can pull to kind of make people feel more sick or better. And
like a weird optometrist. Better one, better two.
yeah.
Vomiting now? No? Okay, we'll keep going.
So that was the plan, and then unfortunately it's not feasible right now, and we explored other ways, like maybe people who have headsets in their homes, but then who's more likely to have headsets in their
Yeah.
homes. And they also have lots of prior experience with it, enough to the point that they've decided to make that investment. So I'm actually working with makers again right now.
Yeah, so the more full question was going to be like, what challenges has COVID presented for your research, and then how have you been able to roll with the punches?
So one way, like I felt so passionately about just getting this message out about it, why are we not talking about gender and cyber sickness, that I worked on a systematic review with Ariel Grimberg and Daniel Harley and my supervisor Mark Hancock, which is being published at CHI 2021, just to let people know kind of what we were seeing and raise that red flag, since we aren't able to do at this point right now. But those studies they're just like at the gate, like raring to go. But until we can safely and have headsets used by multiple people again, we won't be able to. But once the lockdown occurred, I couldn't stop thinking about some of the makers that I had worked with in my first study and how emotional they were about making and how connected they were to their communities. One group called their weekly meetups Therapy Wednesdays, and like they literally cried when talking about like how much it meant to them. And so it broke my heart thinking that they aren't able to do that anymore. And then the researcher side of me was like, well, what are they doing? Like, how are they adapting? And of course, like the HCI perspective on that is how might we use technology to help them get out of those meetings what they used to get out of them. And even in the long term, like there are always going to be people who can't access the physical space. So it's not just something that we could do a better job in right now because of us all having to stay home. It's something that would be beneficial to growing the community and helping people feel included going forward.
This is so fascinating. I mean, I don't think I knew that your research had taken such a turn because of COVID, and I would like to get back to that. But what I'm noticing is how you seem to have this. I don't know if it's been 10 years. I would assume it's probably been 10 years of your academic journey so far. And so you've got this decade-long journey going through understanding how language and our technological world is set up to shape our interactions with people and with our environments. And I just love that you looked at it from many, many perspectives. And now it kind of seems like with this new introduction of COVID, really disrupting what would have been a fine bookend on your research journey, right? Like had you done this VR technology research, the study that you got ethics approval for, it would have been a really nice bookend because you would have been pointing to the people who are impacted by it. You would have had commentary on the makers themselves, and you would have been able to talk about the researchers. And then COVID happens and disrupts that, and suddenly it takes you on this whole other like path to expand it even further and to start saying, all right, we know certain things about technology, what they're capable of doing. How do we flip that on its head and make them do more for the people who in the first place haven't even entered into what the potential could be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's such a nice way of putting it.
I because there was a certain point when you're talking about your research where I go in my head, when you're talking about your VR research, and I go in my head, yes, this is lovely. You can tie it up with a nice bow. You figured it out, right? And you're going to go off into your academic journey. You're going to go off into your career as a user experience researcher, and it's going to be perfect. But then COVID ruins it. and
Yeah.
and I think it's actually a really, really fascinating opportunity, and it usher in a new era for HCI. So perhaps, you're going to be somebody at the forefront of that because you're recognizing that this research isn't only convenient to shift to in COVID, it allows you to do your PhD, but actually, in fact, it is going to be the entire new era that people need to look at. Right? Because connectivity is changing our definition of it. And I mean, if I can just continue my rant for one more second, what I will add to it is something that you told me earlier this year about how the game jams, because they've had to shift to online, we now have people joining from a country, across the world, Taiwan, I believe, and how that wouldn't have been possible before because the person couldn't have flown out from Taiwan for the weekend. But now that we know that that's possible, we're going to look into a hybrid model in the future, and connectivity for us in those maker spaces, we're not going back to how it was before.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, there you go. Sorry. Thank you for indulging my spoken word, but yeah, this is just, it's really important.
Yeah. And like that's so true. And it's funny what you said about tying it up with a bow because like this is like part of the other challenge of doing a PhD is that you have to finish it at some point. And you have a committee who like all of this narrative needs to make sense to. And so after my first making study, I had proposed the VR studies, and then my committee had said maybe it would make a tighter story if you just picked one of these things and didn't try to do both. And then I was like, watch me. No, but so then I thought, yes, the VR studies can be run in a lab environment, so I have control over how fast we can do them, and we can recruit the participants, and it's not the same as like going out to these maker groups where there's gatekeepers and they have different meeting schedules, and you don't know if even just the environment, the atmosphere, how open they will be to you being there and participating in follow-up interviews. So I was very much at the mercy of their setup before, and it was feeling like this would be very difficult to continue studying while also graduating within a time that my department was okay with. So that's like part of the reason why I ended up pivoting. And then in a way, like I'm so hesitant to call COVID a blessing because it's not at all. But now, like, there's nothing I'd rather be studying more than how to support those groups. And I'm glad that I have the opportunity to do that because had this not happened, like it wouldn't have even come up. They would have just continued operating as they were. So there's such a huge opportunity to try to help and try to figure out like what they actually need now that they're in a
Mm-hmm.
situation to be able to speak to what those needs are, as opposed to asking, like, hypothetically, if you could never see each other again, what could
Yeah.
we build for you? Now there's like, they are coming up with stopgap solutions using Discord or Zoom or like whatever quick fixes they can come up with, and they're adapting them to make them work for their specific communities. So they're also learning about their needs along the way, and I am like, I'm so hungry to find out more about them.
Yeah. What you're doing, which I really admire, is you are being the type of researcher who is patient and searches for the right question to ask. And you're adaptable and flexible so that when that question does present itself, you are there to answer it. And it's something that is a strength of yours because it means that you are really genuinely doing this for people. And I think that you're going to make such a huge impact over the course of your career because of all of the things that you're able to bring into your work, including this. So when we're having these conversations, I always do try to find a nice, like, cyclical thing to point out. But um, with you, it's so obvious that your cycle is going to be over a much longer term. You know, I do want to ask though, what have you found out so far about how these groups are adapting?
Um, it's okay. This is very fresh in my mind right now. But very haphazardly, I would say. Like, if one person is like, let's try Discord, then they will just set it up and they'll go from there. Some groups just didn't meet for a while until they figured out what to do, and I'm getting the sense like meeting virtually is not the same. Like, for sure, it's not. But I have been surprised at how much people have been emphasizing the social aspect of it as being so important, which like I knew from before, but I wasn't really sure if people would be like, yeah, the makerspace is closed, so I'm making at home, and that's satisfying for me because I'm getting to continue participating in the making versus, yeah, the makerspace is closed, and now I also have, I'm not able to see my community on a regular basis. That's having a big impact on people. Um, People have been working on their projects at home um, to different degrees, but also struggling with, I think, this sense of meaning and what am I doing that we all have kind of encountered. Um, like, I was very deeply into learning Japanese when the pandemic started, and then on day one, I said, I am going to get so much learning done now. And on day two, I was like, why am I doing this? Like, what does this even matter? There's a pandemic going on out there. Why? And then I've barely done it. So for some people, there's that same kind of struggle with why am I doing this? Like, really thinking about what it means to them and why they do it. And what I'm hoping to see more of are these examples of it being a healthy coping strategy, because it is something to like keep you busy, and I think a lot about tending and mending when it comes to like care practices during this time, where if I'm feeling down, I try to take care of my plants or sew the holes in my socks that have been sitting there for 3 months. And those little actions are really helpful. And it's nice to see when people are able to keep engaging and doing the kind of making activities that they enjoy, as a way of positive and productive, I don't know what to call it again, hobby, leisure. I mean, sometimes it's
I like
not really a
leisure.
hobby. might be like something you actually need in your house too, and that's like empowering to be able to do that.
That's funny. I also was learning Japanese. That was like one of the first go-tos that we had of like, okay, we can't do anything else. We might as well start doing this. And it lasted, I think we went for about a solid month. And then that's about as much as I can stand to learn a language when you're not actually in the place where the language is used. So that's funny. I was like, oh yeah, I can relate to that.
I have all of these cogs in my head, just like, what were you gonna say? Because I always worry I'm gonna just jump back into like a whole rant. So yeah, go ahead.
The Kai conference was supposed to be in Yokohama this year, and I had spent in 2018. I spent a month in Japan, and I went in 2015 as well. So I was on a really good roll, and then I was like, by the time I get to that conference, I am gonna be almost on my PhD. I'm gonna spend like this victory vacation in Japan after the conference, and it's going to be beautiful. And then life was like, no, you're not.
No.
It'll be that much sweeter when you finally get there.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. What is the value for you to go to these Kai conferences in the first place? Because this is something that I've been curious about ever since I've started paying attention to the HCI Touch Lab when I started working here. All of you seem to structure your years around the Kai cycle. So what's the importance of it?
It's somewhat unfortunate that in our field, there, like on Google Scholar, there's a ranking of the different HCI conferences, and Kai is number one. And then there's CSCW, which is computer supported cooperative work, and a few others that people also will submit to, but Kai is like the be all end all. And the deadlines are typically in September-ish, and there's one deadline a year. So like if you miss it, then you might just be sitting on something for a whole year, which when you're trying to finish your program is not good. But there are usually always other conferences you can submit to that are like excellent places to publish, and I've been to quite a few of the different ones, and they're so lovely because they are smaller, so there's better interaction with people, and if they have a more specific focus interest, then you're actually getting to meet people who are more engaged with your topic. But it's because of the, I guess, impact factor in academic terms. Kai just seems to be what everyone goes for. But I think there's also a positive shift towards more of like a hybrid journal conference model in HCI conferences, because like the way I always explain it to people is that journals aren't number one in HCI because the field moves so fast. That's why we have conferences. But then that brings up, the one do or die deadline a year. So CSCW has, I don't know how many per year. I'm tempted to say 4. It might be 3. It might be 2 deadlines a year. And there's a revise and resubmit cycle, but it's still a conference. But it takes off that huge pressure to deliver that one time. And it also gives you opportunities to genuinely improve your work and resubmit to the next cycle, instead of what we currently have, which is a rebuttal cycle where you get the reviews, you write one page of, please, I'll do everything that you said, please adjust your score and accept our paper. And then you try really hard to make all those changes before you have to submit the camera ready paper. Because I think there's just recognition throughout that people are burnt out and stressed, and we need to be kinder, and that will have a positive effect on the quality of the work and the community too. I don't think I actually answered your question though.
Oh, I think you did.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I think it's important to spell out in that way because people don't necessarily understand how HCI works since it is comparatively a hybrid field between, you have folks from psychology, systems, computer science, there's public health heavily involved in there too. So you can't necessarily measure it against the same standards. I know, from my perspective as somebody who publishes about research milestones, it's tempting sometimes to privilege a book release over a conference paper, but that's just, you can't. It's like comparing apples to bananas. And that's not fair because apples are way superior. Mangoes to
Whoa,
apples.
whoa, 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 whoa.
Yeah,
but
my
yeah.
banana here would beg to differ.
Oh, get it away. I'm allergic. But yeah, that's why I always want people to know that when it comes to HCI work, it is the conference publication. It is equivalent probably to a journal. That's probably the best comparison. Or book chapter.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, there is an obvious question that we need to ask you, although it's like so painfully obvious. Let's go for it. What, in your opinion, is the value of A, being so interdisciplinary in your own approach, but B, collaborating with folks from other disciplines inside the Touch Lab and also on research projects? Sorry, inside the broader HCI group. Yeah.
Well, no one can be an expert on all things. Um, and I think I owe a lot to my undergrad just in how I'm able to recognize my own limitations. And thankfully, that also gave me an ability to kind of like talk the talk and walk the walk in these different fields enough to communicate needs and questions and so on, but not to do and not to have the depth of knowledge and experience to know if I'm totally off track. Um, so almost everyone in the GI is so like it's very interdisciplinary, but also everyone's an expert on their own thing. So why am I gonna learn about physiological measures when I can ask Leonard or something like
Yeah.
that, you know? Um, it's just, yeah, it's efficient, and it also I think it's like a quality thing too. And
Uh-huh.
then they will also ask questions about what perspective I'm bringing to the work because I often am bringing the like, let's look at this through a feminist lens kind of thing. And then people are like, why? And then like I get to share my side of that too, and it's like a mutual benefit.
Yes. Okay. Soundbite that, Tobin. That's such an interesting um, way to answer it because those are the two things that I think a lot of people actually feel are the reasons to not take interdisciplinary approaches, right? They think that it's going to be less efficient and it might even diminish the quality of their work. Because if you're bringing in, folks from other disciplines, they don't do it the same way that you do, and that could accidentally be interpreted as their standards are lower. But no, it's more efficient and it improves the quality, and you just made me so happy.
Yeah, and then like later on, I will have learned something about, to use the same example, physiological measures, so that if
Mm-hmm.
it comes up again, I can at least be like, based on my limited experience, yes, this will work, or no, it may not, or this seems fishy. Let's go find out more about it. So like, I don't think you can lose.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you are trying to be the expert in all things, and then you get one of those like really superficially interdisciplinary publications that are just like calling themselves that for brownie points, but not contributing anything really meaningful. I've unfortunately like seen some of those. Um, just as a reviewer, but you can see it. Like, it's easy to tell.
All right, so let's begin to wrap up. Could you hint at what's next for you? Where's your research going to go? Or do you have plans to continue being effective during this COVID era?
I probably spilled the beans a little too much already on kind of the work that I'm doing with remote making. That's my main focus at this time, and also starting to write my dissertation and applying to faculty positions and postdocs to be able to continue all that VR work, for example, that is ready to go. That's something that I care a lot about, and even in writing the systematic review, came up with so many more questions that need to be answered, like ones that could be an entire master's project for someone. So I'm looking for where it would be a good fit to continue doing that kind of research and all these equity related questions that I want to get answered.
Awesome. Are you playing any games these days?
I play Pokemon Go so much.
I
It's
used to play that. I
I remember
had to
walking from the
stop.
GI with you recently. You were like, "Oh, Pokestop, we gotta stop," and I'm like, "Come on."
Oh my gosh. I
That was
love
a
it so
lifetime
much,
ago.
but it was interfering with my Apple CarPlay.
Oh boy.
But I'm so glad to know that you're playing it because again, like you and I 1-to-1 on the games.
I actually started in May of last year because I thought it would be like a nice way to get outside and interact with the outdoors and whatever. And then I got so hooked on it. I'm almost level 46 now. They raised the level cap to 50.
No big deal.
And now you'll get a chance to go back and relive those Magic School Bus games. That'll take up your weekend.
Yeah, I'm so excited about that. Like, forget the weekend. Like, this is going to be the rest of my afternoon.
I mean,
You're welcome.
I was gonna say what's next for us is other than playing a ton of Magic School Bus, is we have to go back this weekend. I'm probably gonna take up Pokemon Go again. Thank you for that. Try to but I'll also I don't know if I want to. Your score's too high. But also I just need to I need to sit with all the things I'm thinking about. I'm reeling after this conversation. What I'm thinking about right now is how my online environment over the past year has changed. What can I say to make it so eloquent? Like the infrastructure and the fabric of my life, right? You're talking about when there's too much. We need an episode 2 on this. I'm trying I'm trying to wrap it up, but I have to say I am just absolutely reeling. So Pokemon Go, Magic School Bus, mind-boggling.
All right. So as Marisa stitches together the fabric of her brain, let's end with this question. So if you could have everyone in the world play one game, what would it be?
This is and your screen is matched so perfectly.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. This is so difficult. Why did you do this to me?
Well,
look at
what you did to us.
On the one hand, I'm like, Pokemon Go, then you can all be my friends and get more points. But I don't know. What do other people say? Like maybe my other inclination is the goose game because everyone needs a chance to just be a little brat, like unapologetically. Like I'm a troll sometimes at heart, not a toxic one, just annoying. So for me, like the goose game is a great outlet because you can just pester the gardener and stuff and honk at people, and it makes me happy.
Okay, hang on. You know why you like the goose game? Because it strips away the pretense of how language and structures shape the way that we can interact with the world and other people. And the goose just lets you do whatever.
Yeah, you're just a goose. You're just trying to have a good time. The only thing that's stopping you is society.
Yeah. It's an outlet to get away from society for a while. And then when you come back into society, your eyes are open to everything, and then you can design better and you can experience things better. There you go.
Yeah, be more like the goose.
This has been so fun. I'm very I'm sad we're at the end of our time, but I'm very glad to be able to continue to work with you because we didn't even talk about this, but Cayley is in fact a part-time GI staff member because she looks after Slack and supports our community. So you know, you talk about how all of these other communities have adapted, but you've had a huge hand in helping our research community translate to the online space.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I live on Slack.
Mm-hmm.
I am Slack.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to know more about what Cayley has been doing in Slack, because we didn't talk about it today, the Games Institute puts out a weekly newsletter called What's Happening at the Games Institute, where we provide updates about our Slack community. And then we also feature new things going on in Slack in our instant replay, which comes out at the end of every academic term. Yeah, so we'll have to link that stuff in the chat or in the show notes, whatever we're doing here. or we can also make a promise that at one point in the future we will come back together on the podcast and we can talk about more things. Yeah.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been
Thank
wonderful.
you for having me. This has been really fun.